interconnectedness has ended up feeding into the evolution of geopolitical competition especially among the great powers, and especially between the United States and China. Because the United States had, for well over a decade, assumed that China, as its economic power was growing, would end up incorporating itself into the United States-led world economic order, the United States, were basically caught napping, and China has ended up eating our lunch on this issue. Now, what happened, of course, was the pandemic, and that, like so many other things, it was a crisis that provoked action. But let me just point out that President Biden's executive order of last month, February, that directed all parts of the U.S. government and the U.S. government in collaboration with the private sector to dig into the issue of climate change and come up with recommendations. And yes, for once, talking about great decisions, we actually do have some decisions that will be within a matter of months and then within a year on the agenda to help the United States catch up. That's sort of what we're looking at. But to put this in context, the issue of supply chains is really, really old. In fact, supply chains and national security is merely the terminology that we use today for what is essentially the use of economics as an instrument of power in long-term strategic competition. And the origins of that go back to the 5th century BC, when the Peloponnesian War broke out with the Trojans marching north, moving into Athens territory and slicing the roots of the olive trees that Athens used as its basic source of a fundamental food supply and as one of its major exports. So it really is a core issue. From the current perspective of the United States, national security is all about defending ourselves by solving the problems that we have with supply chains that Olivette is going to talk about. But I think it's important to point out that from a strategic perspective, it's a dynamic issue. In other words, right now, China is the rising power and is in a position of using its ability to dominate and control supply chains as an offensive tool. And it has geopolitical purposes, but at the root is also an ideological issue. So China is essentially a mercantilist state in which all economic activities are intended from the Chinese point of view to serve the growth of the state, to serve the purposes of the state. Whereas we, as a liberal capitalist economy, enjoy things like belief in free trade and open economies. Now, of course, this is the big issue that China has taken advantage of, basically utilizing open economies and freedom of trade to increase its not only its wealth, something that we support, but also its power. In the modern age, we talk about chips and cyber today, but it used to be oil and steel. I mean, if you think about it, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that launched World War II was essentially the Japanese military response to the Roosevelt administration decision to interrupt Japan's supply chain in the Pacific region to secure oil and petroleum products. I mean, that's sort of reducing it into a simple nutshell, but that's what it was all about. So that's one example. Similarly, the United States agreement with Saudi Arabia to provide American-based security in exchange for oil from the Persian Gulf was a supply chain agreement. It guaranteed the secure supply of oil from the Arabian Peninsula to the United States and its allies in exchange for security. So that's another example of how this is a fundamental historical issue. So just to sort of, I think I don't want to take a whole lot of time here, but and I'm not going to talk about solutions. I think the solution set is largely known. It's not a mystery. But the big question, of course, is where is this going to go? And I do want to say that there is a historical precedent that by no means guarantees that the positive promise of globalization, that the interconnectedness of societies and economies that would provide growing wealth for all would also lead to a more peaceful world. And I'll just close with an anecdote that I think illustrates that extremely well, which was the book by Norman Angell titled The Great Illusion, published in 1913. And he was an English economist who wrote that because the world of the late 19th century and early 20th century had become so connected and interdependent with each other that it would be too costly. It would be irrational for Germany and the European powers to go to war with each other. And we all know what happened in August of 1914. Norman Angell was proved entirely wrong. So is guaranteeing our supply chains a vital US interest? You bet it is. And the challenge is not only to this very specific issue, but it ties to everything else that is driving us in our new situation of increasing geopolitical competition, to up our game, to adapt, and even to the extent of shifting the very terms of our economic model as we go forward. All right, so let me stop with that and hand it over to Olivette.
Go ahead, Olivette. Do you want me to put your slides up on screen?
Yes, please.
Voila.
Okay, I'll pick up from that point. And let's go back to the point that you identified from, Todd, that you identified from the Chinese, how the Chinese markets, and we started catering to the Chinese markets, and those Chinese markets were providing us what we needed for our economy and our base for marketing. One of the things that we did was we market out all of our essential requirements that we needed for PP&E. So I'm going to go and talk about my organization and what I had to do for my organization as it relates to today versus what it would have related to years ago when we had our own market and our own abilities to fulfill those requirements. We have marketed out anything that we had in the way of making, or we export the materials, but we have the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and the different other countries to actually put things together for us, make it for us, and then import it back to the United States, in which we pick it up and we put it into our warehouses and we store. So in essence, the raw material we provide in many of our cases. We also provide the diagrams as to what we were looking for and how we want to have things made. And China and Vietnam and different countries will make these items for us, and they will send them back here to the United States. The one thing that we didn't do is that we got into the just-in-time requirement to meet our supply needs here in the domestic side of the house in the United States, which when we went into the just-in-time, that just-in-time means we only buy those things that we need. And those things that we don't need, we leave it in the global market to spread out and share with the global economies. Well, we didn't bring enough to the United States so that we can have what we needed here in the United States. When the pandemic hit the United States, we were faced to come up with personal protective equipment, and that personal protective equipment, which is called today as PPE, you see that's a common term now. Those supplies that we needed for that requirement, we didn't have enough. We had only what we felt we needed to have. So our just-in-time system didn't really work for us because we weren't prepared for any emergency or anything that will remotely get us into the position to take care of the larger economy requirements. And so as a result of us not having what we needed, we found ourselves short. The president declared a pandemic here in the United States, and that pandemic came with overburdened hospitals, overburdened supply systems, overburdened everything that we needed to have. All of our stores that had anything that could help us in the way of PPE, they didn't have anything because they sold it all to the organizations. And in this case, when I say organization, at the national strategic level, when the president declared us a pandemic, the national strategic level for the pandemic, they declared what federal agencies and our priorities for support for our federal agencies. Our first federal priority that was identified was hospitals, medical and treatment facilities, senior citizens activities. Then they went from first responders. First responders were the next area that we had to provide the PPE for. The third area of priority was the DoD military. Now, the military, luckily for us, are within their own. They maintain a strategic level and a national operating level for the military forces. So they were able to accommodate themselves. Then we went to the fourth level, which is GSA, who is the buy-in agency for all of the federal agencies here in the United States domestic population. Well, GSA relied on those vendors that everybody else was going to acquire resources. So all federal agencies became priority 5. So when we needed things, we had to go through GSA if we wanted to get it a higher priority. What we found out is that we didn't have enough resources to meet the agencies at all the federal agencies or the national levels of requirements that we needed. We didn't have enough. We looked at everything from trying to figure out how we could band-aid the requirements, or if we couldn't band-aid the requirements, materials together, we ended up looking at getting mom and pop to create our requirements. That wasn't going to get us anywhere. That was still too small. We looked at activities, actually engineers doing the UV bans and started to bring the UV bans to the area so we can reuse what we already had. But as for my federal agency that I had to supply, I had to go out and acquire the necessary PPE. So I'm bring myself back to my federal agency. I had to look at what was out there in the marketplace in which I could be able to pull from. I couldn't pull from anywhere. I had to look in-house to see what I had in-house. I didn't have anything in-house other than what I needed for our emergency requirements just in time support. Then we had to look at what government sources could we find. DoD was my first source that I went to. They provided us support. I went to GSA. GSA had vendors, but the vendors provided us what support they had, but most of their support was not the primary sources. We had to decide what kind of sources we could pull from. A lot of our sources were coming from Chinese companies. There were US companies that get all of their resources from the Chinese. And the Chinese warehouses, they weren't providing us anything because their own country needed what they had. So we really didn't have a whole lot. Then we went to the commercial industry to find out what we could get from the commercial side. What we were able to get from the commercial side was the cotton face mask that we needed. So I'm going to talk about one particular type item, and that's the face mask. And we went to the commercial market for the face mask. And when we was trying to get the face mask, we ended up getting on a wait list so they could make what we needed using cotton based on the CDC's requirements. So we ended up using the cotton. We went from the face mask from the FEMA. They ordered us and got face masks for us. GSA was unable to get us a cotton face mask. So we ended up with HHS providing us face masks. So that was from the commercial market. So that didn't really actually take care of everything we needed to do. So we had to do some internal steps. So we had to make some decisions internally to our federal agency to decide whether we could in fact be able to self-sustain our workforce. So we had to make the decision to either make it in-house or to buy it. We felt it was more, for us, it was more appropriate for us to buy since we didn't have in-house capabilities. Then we had to look at our specifications and our requirements. What was it that we needed to have in order to keep our workforce safe? We had to acquire that information from CDC and then apply it to GSA to look up these particular items and identify what we could buy. So we ended up buying those things. Then we looked at the strategic sourcing. When we looked at strategic sourcing, we could have gone, individual, or we can do it as an organization, as an agency. We've decided to do it as an enterprise agency. So we purchased for the entire agency. Then we had to also look at the transportation. We had to look at the storing, and we had to look at the end of life because, eventually we hope the pandemic will come to an end and face masks will no longer be a requirement. And then we had to also, if that's the case, we have to look at our disposal activity as it relates to that. Some of the lessons learned that we identified in this process is that we didn't have any national strategic identified levels at all. Now, we understood that when the previous administration left out, they had identified potential for a pandemic. And in that potential, they had broken out the different types of pandemics they could foresee coming to the United States. Medical was one of them, a bacteria or something of that nature coming to the United States and we would have to react to. There was a plan, but that plan was they weren't able to implement that plan because it was no longer available. So we now have to look at building that plan again for, if we're looking at the national strategic stockage expectation for a pandemic. And we also have to look at having that plan internally to the United States and decide where we will put some kind of stockage objectives associated with that particular product. The last thing we looked at was developing an agency stockage level. Is that practical for us to do something like that when we really don't know in the future what the next pandemic is going to be, what the next major requirement is going to be. And then we looked at the marketing side of the house, suppliers. But we have to start looking internally to, I believe, to start setting up our own markets so that we're able to take care of ourselves a little better and not looking to rely on importing everything that we need to have. And then we have to also avoid counterfeits. We had major issues when it came to counterfeits. A lot of our vendors being helpful, tried to give us what they had, and it was counterfeit, and it was going to be, it wasn't appropriate for us to make those things available to our workforce. We didn't want to hurt our workforce. We wanted to keep them healthy. And so those counterfeit items had to be identified and set aside. So once you get a counterfeit, and you have your entire shipment comes in, it's counterfeit, you can't use it. So you're now looking at spending twice the amount of money to meet the requirement. So those are some of the things that we looked at, the lessons that we learned in reference to acquiring PPE for our organization, our workforce. It wasn't easy, but we know that in the future that we're going to have to do some internal planning, and we're going to have to look at the global market to see if we can influence the global market for future requirements. And this is just an agency level from a domestic point of view.
Thanks, Olivette. But really interesting how the supply chain and unfortunate broke down with the pandemic. And of course, the administration didn't expect a pandemic and then didn't really know how to react to it. I just wanted to start, which I usually don't, by mentioning that on Thursday with Ambassador Luis Moreno, he's sort of my favorite ambassador, so that's why I want to mention it. We served together in Haiti, and he was on the tarmac welcoming Aristide back. And then 10 years later, he put Aristide on the plane and sent him off to the Central African Republic. Anyway, he is pretty amazing and a great friend. So I hope you'll tune in. So back to our value chain discussion. Well, Todd did a nice job of giving you background, and Olivette really let us know what it's like to try to deal with it when unfortunately nothing's available. You can't make it and you can't buy it. And it seems to me that's one of the big issues that Biden needs to deal with. Although, as she indicated, which is pretty interesting, had the Trump administration continued with the preparations made by the Obama administration, things might have been somewhat better. What I wanted to talk about briefly is just, well, what is a value chain, for goodness sakes? I wanted to use the scarf I have on this morning. So if we were just looking at this scarf and say, well, it was made in the United States, then downstream there are the sheep, and then the farmers, and then the transport, and then the product is made, and then you have the advertisement, you have the transport, and then you have the shops that sell it. Now, if this scarf was made in Haiti, where I was chief of mission for value chain, I bet you didn't know that, Sandy, project, then probably it was a Chinese operation. They owned the plant with Haitian workers and cloth from maybe Madagascar. And then that is sailed on a vessel, which is probably a Liberian flag, arrived in Haiti, and then put together by low-cost Haitian workers, shipped out again by whatever are the cheapest vessels, and in some case flown if it's an item that the fashion industry needs right away, and put into shops in the United States or in South America, Africa, wherever. In fact, one of the main things about China is they sell all these textiles to Africa, which is kind of unfortunate because that's actually something that Africa should be manufacturing itself. But the point I'm trying to make is that value chain just exists every place. Any product that you purchased has gone through a value chain because just from the fact that you bought it someplace, that means a store was handling it and somebody made it. So at least there's two steps. I mean, if we were trading agricultural produce in a subsistence society, there wouldn't be too much value chain. But in fact, in today's world, value chain is how we trade, it's how we invest. And when it really became dynamic was after World War II. And of course, Todd pointed out that I can't remember the name of the author that said, well, it can't happen because we're too interdependent, that we would have a war about value chains. But the important thing about that is we had a war about value chains because one country and two countries in particular, at least in the Second World War, thought that they weren't getting enough value out of the value chain. Germany wanted to, the rising power, confront Britain over its control of trade and all its colonies that it sold to. And Japan had its co-prosperity zone, and it wanted to control the trade in the Far East. And so the idea of value chains, first of all, has been very beneficial. It's pulled up countries around the world. It's allowed, first Japan, remember when Japan made all those cheap things? Well, if you're my age, you remember it. And then it became more sophisticated, went to China, and then China began more sophisticated. So trade and value chains have made the world a more prosperous place. And one of the things that countries and regions have done to deal with value chains is to form trade blocs, probably the most successful of which is the European Union. But we have the African Growth and Opportunity Act that the United States started with Africa to try to promote African trade. We have African regional trade blocs. We had the Asian Pacific Trade Agreement that would have been very beneficial for applying pressure on China by bringing together the region. So I wanted to make the point, because the article I thought failed to do so, that value chain is basically the foundation of the international system that we have today. The question, though, is how do you make China behave and be a member of the value chain and the World Trade Organization, such as the World Trade Organization and the GATT. And I don't think you do that by, as the article suggests, decoupling China, because then you're going to run into the same thing that Todd mentioned, that, you know, Japan went to war because it thought the United States was cutting it off. So China, if it really thinks that the United States is cutting it off and the United States has enough power with its allies to do so, we do risk conflict and confrontation. So what to do? I obviously don't have all the solutions, but I think one thing where we made a mistake is we assumed China would play by the rules of the game, and it didn't. It began substituting its own products for a lot of, at first it was just putting things together, and then pretty soon it was stealing secrets and manufacturing components itself. So now China has to play by the rules, and we and our allies have to force China to be a good player, not cut it out, but make it part of the international system and penalize it when it fails to not to be. Obviously, there's a lot of adaptation and planning that has to go into the international value chain system, now that we've learned, as Olivette has pointed out, that there's some things we just can't rely on other countries for. And so we have to decide what that is, and whether we're just going to rely on our allies, or maybe just rely on our allies in developing countries, and that we're not going to rely for certain things on our competitors. All of that, we should take a look at. But I don't believe we should be tearing down the system that has served us generally so well over the last 80 years since World War II. So maybe back to Todd to comment on anything that Olivette or I had to say, or add anything more you'd like to.
I'll make a couple quick points. One is, to make a distinction between value chains and supply chains, that the supply chain is the actual physical physical properties that are being the elements, starting with raw materials, that are being supplied and created into products and traded, and value chain, which is what really where we got kind of unhooked, which is where the American private sector for the most part was focusing. And value can consist of things, of commodities that are rare and scarce, and therefore give opportunities to make a profit on. But there is also value in intellectual property, in technology, in the sorts of things that the American economy has become very good at excelling at. And when you add the globalization dimension into it, for example, if you dominate the financial market, you also acquire greater value out of dominating the value end of supply chain. So that's really the dynamic that China has learned to manipulate and utilize for its benefit, for the benefit of the Chinese state, which makes a fundamental difference here between the United States operating on what's called the comparative advantage liberal economic model. Is not focused exclusively on making the United States a more powerful country, but on increasing the wealth and welfare of its population. So a very different order. One other quick point is one of the reasons that we're sort of in a defensive position, which I think Olivette explained perfectly, that the pandemic was a crisis, but the Biden administration in this executive order identifies 4 sectors of the economy for rapid study within 100 days, and 6 larger sectors where transformations are needed within a year. So we're talking. So if you take the way that Olivette explained about PPE in response to the pandemic, apply those to semiconductors, to chips, to high capacity batteries, to the full range of pharmaceuticals, and to minerals and other strategic materials. In other words, this really stretches across the whole economy.
And thanks, Todd. Olivette, so would you just completely cut off the idea of having China supply any PPE after what you went through?
No, even though China didn't play fair, because they had a need for the PPE themselves. And so we have to understand, if we were the only country that had a need, I think China would have given us the PPE, but I also think we would have to buy it on a premium price. So I believe we would have been able to acquire the PPE from China, but the whole world was having an issue. And so the whole world needed the same resource. So China kept its resources internal to themselves. They even pulled back from the domestic activities here in the United States for themselves. So, I don't think we should pull back. I think we need to make sure that we have some capacity to make some things here in the United States and export those things that we need to have involved, but also have some capability here. We didn't have that capability here. We were relying solely on international markets to provide us what we needed. And that's where we need to go back and assess our market ability here in the United States.
So that was really a wake-up call.
A big time wake-up call. I mean, we had to assess our entire mission to determine what was essential that needed to have personnel here for. It affected our workforce. It affected our ability to respond if we had any other crisis to take place, a flooding, anything could have happened. So we would have had to really figure out how to manage that. And so we didn't have that. So we were lucky. But the point is that we need to make the market, and we need to figure out what our national requirements will be. And we need to put ourselves in a position so that it rotates. So if we buy a large strategic level, it has to rotate through our supply chain system here in the domestic market, so that we can bring in fresh all the time to keep ourselves resupplied. It'll be an internal resupply within the domestic area of the United States. It'll be our medical, our offices, our clinics, however we want to identify.
Yeah, that's a really great point about the rotation. We have a question which is clearly for you, Todd. It's from Deborah Letelier.
Hilliard.
Thank you, Sandy. Can someone expand on the topic of the Biden administration's 4 critical areas to research, fix now, and the subsequent 6 categories in need of solution within the year? So Todd, you were just beginning to talk about those 4 areas. Could you elaborate?
Sure. And one of the enormous reliefs that we all share by having a reasonably rational, coherent administration with an A team of appointees is the ability to conceive of problems and mobilize, use the White House as a vehicle for mobilizing ways of addressing them. I mean, that is one of the strengths that America has, the ability to galvanize action and to adapt. So President Biden, within 30 days of taking office, signed an executive order. Another feature of this is no confusion, no chaos, no box of snakes, and no obscurity about what's going on. Anybody can go Google that executive order and read it. So we've got the 4 sectors that I mentioned, which I think you sort of would grasp that, and then the six sectors for which there's a 1-year timeline to basically study the issue and come up with recommendations, but at the same time work with Congress to develop legislation that may be necessary. And this is very interesting because this is an issue that has wide bipartisan support. So here's a chance to get some things moving on the congressional side. So the 6 sectors are, number 1, and most important, the defense industrial base. So think you're not just buying face masks for PPE from China and other countries, you're buying critical elements of weapon systems and technology that goes into defending the country. So getting a handle on that. And I'll just go quickly through the rest of the list. Public health and biological preparedness, which is where the pandemic comes in. Information and communications technology, which you would, computers basically. And then incorporating chips into that. The energy sector, transportation, so vehicles and everything from vehicles to railroad cars, and agricultural commodities and food, something we don't think about too much. But that has a dotted line, for example, to immigration, to the immigration bill. I mean, if you did not have adequate number of farm workers to domestically pick your crops, your supply chain is going to be immediately interrupted. And the fact that a significant number of those are without legal immigration status could make that even more vulnerable. So I hope that's a sufficient answer on that one.
Yeah, yes, and thank you. But I wanted to also just go back for a minute to Olivette, because you're talking about the rotation. Can you explain that a little bit more?
From my perspective, the defense has the largest amount of medical resupply for PP&E. And I'm talking for a national level to bring in the requirement and maintain a stockage level and rotate that through the medical, defense, any agency, and always like a rotational basis, just bring in new and replace out. Because otherwise it sits in a warehouse, you don't have a need, and then all of a sudden we're doing that disposal action because the items haven't been used, they passed their expiration date, they're really not usable. So now you got to buy, you have to spend money to buy the whole thing all over again. So if you just bring it in and then you rotate, bring it down, and every time you bring something down, you bring something in new so that you maintain a steady stockage level and you only pull from that stockage level and you distribute it out to the economy or to the hospitals, whoever needs to have the requirement. When I was on active duty, I was maintaining the, and I'm just going to give another area that I maintained for the defense. It was batteries. If you remember back during 9/11 and the soldiers were deployed, there was a big article about batteries and that the soldiers were deployed and they needed batteries for the night vision goggles and so forth, and their flashlights, all kinds of things. The Department of the Army, who I was a part of at the time, we had a battery activity that made the batteries. And we had all kinds of contracts trying to fill this requirement because the batteries that we had at our strategic and our operational level at that time, and it's not that way anymore, but at that time had sat and waited for a need. And so now we have a need and all of them are dead or past their expiration date and we only get a day or two out of them. So we have to rotate our stock appropriately to bring in new, issue it out. First in, first out. You know, if you bring it in first, it's out the door first. If you bring it in and you have a large stock, you just keep bringing it in and working your way through until you get a brand new stock always ready to go.
Yeah.
So that's the most important thing we need to do is rotate our stock so that our stock never gets stale and we never end up having to find some big hole to bury a whole bunch of batteries.
And it also allows companies to know that they're going to stay in business because there's going to be a reoccurring demand.
It will stimulate the market. It will stimulate the market. Yeah. The market will always know that there's going to be requirements for certain things on a regular basis because they're rotating the national stock.
So back to you, Todd. I'm thinking about these 6 categories, which really cover the whole economy. I mean, we're talking about transport to technology to defense to protective gear. Where are they going to come out on this? We have very little manufacturing in the United States. Are we suddenly going to try to take over all the manufacturing of these components and supplies because we think they're critical?
The answer is not take it over, but change the public-private sector balance. And that's and just picking up on Olivette's comment about the batteries. And the idea of cycling your strategic stockpile through. Once you identify certain items as quote unquote strategic, that implies a public role in making that market. In other words, if it will be contracting out to private suppliers to manufacture those items, maybe even in some cases to store and distribute them. but as a response to government industrial policy or actual government possession. It changes the balance of the state-private sector mix in doing that, but the intent is to ensure that when an item is truly strategic, and that, that can be everything from silicone chips to personal protective gear, that they will be available and according to higher need of certain sectors of the population. Let me just give another illustration of that, something that's existed since the Korean War, which is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Basically it was designed to keep the US Navy afloat in the case of an interruption of petroleum supplies. Lesson learned, just like we're talking about lessons learned from the pandemic, lesson learned during World War II. And that supply, we don't really think about it, still exists today. It's actually been used a number of times when spot market oil shortages have turned up to fill in and rebalance the global market. But what we're talking about at the end of the day are literally huge underground storage tanks I think primarily in Louisiana, but spread around the country, of oil. Another good example of this.
Well, Olivette, you've worked for government, I take it, for most of your life. Can government really organize this effectively and efficiently? Or are we looking at government control, socialism? Do we have to be kind of careful of this?
Oh, great question. Yeah.
Now, I would say no. And the reason I say no is that the government today is more, we have compartmentalized ourselves. We know what national defense is. We know what our military organizations are, but none of us can do it without our civilian community. I mean, we have all kinds of individuals within that makes up our requirements. We have contractors that come in and they do elements. 876 was something that came out in 1979. That said, if the commercial entity can provide us that support, then that's where we are to go first to get that requirement. Do not bring it into the government and have the government take care of it, because the government may or may not be the best source or best to maintain it. So we have an excellent mix between our civilian counterparts, our federal civilian counterparts, our military counterparts, and so forth. And this is in the defense chain. But if you're looking outside the defense, in the nursing side of the house, our first responders, they all need the same stuff. We all need it. And we have contractors come in and provide us their services. The pandemic, we couldn't get through with not having the nurses and the medical communities that had contracted ambulances and all that kind of stuff. We all pitched in, and we'll all pitch in the future as well. But no, I don't think the government should be totally responsible. I think we need to partner with everyone that has something to bring to the table. I think we need to partner.
Thank you, Todd.
So I see someone has their hand raised with a question.
Yeah,
There is a question, but I would like to, I will ask that question, but I would like to hear whether you agree with Olivette on the fact that the government can manage a private, and she made a very elegant case,
Yeah.
a private-public partnership.
We're talking about exactly the same thing. When I'm talking about changing the mix in the public-private sector relationship, I'm totally on board with Olivette. You do not want to make the U.S. federal government in particular the sole source of responsibility for things that really involve the entire country. That would be an incredibly inefficient way to go about it. And there, you know, this is something in which the United States has amazing experience that no other country has. For example, you know, to the extent that it remains in collective memory, it's embedded in regulations associated with the Defense Production Act, which evolved out of experience in World War II. You know, and that's what allowed the country to mobilize not just, you know, millions of people into the armed forces to fight this gigantic war on two global fronts, but to mobilize the entire society and economy around that. It was very much a mix of public and private sector that allowed that to happen. And I think that there, you know, I'd be interesting to see what the groups that are working now on silicone chips come up with. I'll be very surprised if it's fundamentally new in terms of institutional organization. In terms of technology, I think we're going to see some really sophisticated stuff coming out. For example, right now, when you're, you know, the problem of counterfeits. What do you do when you come up with counterfeits? You come across it. Maybe you want to, you monitor your supplies to make sure they're not coming in, or you have to go investigate. Well, what if you have an artificial intelligence program that's operating a blockchain operation, collecting huge data of all suppliers around the world? You're going to be dealing with aspects of that problem in very, very, I'd say futuristic ways, but that's something that may be coming on stream very quickly.
Well, Virginia McCullen has a good question because she's asking about rare earth minerals, and you're talking about high-tech silicone chips, and you need the rare earth minerals to manufacture many of these. And China sort of seems to have a monopoly on many of the rare earth minerals. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the need for the demand for rare earth minerals for this high-tech equipment is impacted by the fact that they're rare and they're hard to get, and China seems to have access to most of them?
So this is where rare earths is somewhere where China has exercised its strategic advantage as a mercantilist economy. In other words, they've used economic power to secure exclusive contracting and set up enterprises that have dominated probably about 80% of production. They also benefit from the ability to, they're really, in a sense, it's not really a state of where rule of law presides, but rather a political party presides, to do things like not have to follow what would be termed world standard environmental regulations, which apply directly to the mining sector in particular, something that's been a great disincentive for not just the United States, but other industrialized economies, have greatly reduced their involvement in the mining sector. And the same thing applies, for example, when you're dealing with foreign countries, many of which are the sources of rare earth minerals, the ones that are outside of China. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, something that operates very well in terms of our liberal ideas of building the capacity of nations to have stronger, more effective governance. But if you don't need to pay attention to that, then you can go around and pay bribes and exploit corruptive opportunities to secure your supplies as well.
It's very interesting that one of the main sources is the Congo,
Yeah.
and the Eastern Congo, which of course is generally in conflict. Olivette, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you join us. And I wonder if you have any last words before we sign off.
No, I don't. I honestly appreciate the invitation. Um, I read the article, and I will identify that we need to have diversity in our industrial base, which we don't really have right now. We need to look at securing and quality and acquiring quality assets for assurances and our requirements. And then we need to take another look at our supply chain and see how we can manage it better. Because domestically, we didn't do a very good job. I think internationally, we do a much better job.
So Olivette, can I ask you a question? It's not exactly supply chain, but I would be interested in your views. It's sort of related because it very much has to do with resiliency and diversity, the sorts of things that are necessary to keep your supply chain going. What's your opinion on the incredible year that 2020 was for space? Really the private sector in space and what looks to be a really healthy partnership with NASA. But I'd be really interested sort of on your inside view on that.
Well, I believe we have a very healthy partnership with many of our SpaceX, Boeing, several of our space partners. And we've had, during 2020, we had 3 major successes. We had some launches that take place, and 2 of them were SpaceX and 1 was our own. And so even with the pandemic, we were still able to ensure that NASA's and our partners' missions went off without a hitch. So I would say that we can't do it alone. And so for me, I'm very happy to be a part of the organization that I am part of. And we have accomplished quite a bit during the pandemic to keep America alive in all the eyes of the world, for the people in the world around us.
I so like that.
And they're capitalizing on that.
It's still a global world and we're interdependent, and the United States is still a leader in the global world, and we have to look for new and innovative ways to make sure that it's advantageous to everyone.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and if anybody's worried about America in decline, take a look at NASA. NASA is. I totally agree. It shows you, hey, this is what America still not only can do but still does.
okay, Sandy, back to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. That was a great discussion. I couldn't agree more. When I was looking at the landing of the rover on Mars and the artificial intelligence involved, it's just staggering. It's staggering. It's an amazing accomplishment, no doubt sourced with parts from all over the world.
No, and hey, Voyager, right?
Totally.
Voyager, it's in interstellar space and it's still beeping back information. 1977 was the launch.
Oh, and look at the International Space Station.
Yes.
That's a piece of engineering that's more than 20 years beyond its life expectancy and still there.
Now we're going to send a satellite toward the sun and then use the sun power to flip it out into far deep space.
It might not be able to, it's always possibility. Always possibility. Every time somebody say it can't be done, it's done. Exactly. It's just a matter of figuring it out.
That's right. Well, that's a great comment to end things on. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Olivette Hooks. What a great pleasure to have you joining us here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Todd and Vicki, thanks as always. Your insights are just always so super appreciated. And I'm really looking forward to Thursday's conversation, Vicki, between you and Luis Moreno. it will be a good one. So thanks to both of you very much.
Thank you.
And for everyone else out there, we will see you for the next Great Decisions this coming Tuesday, a week today. We'll feature Dr. Todd Greentree again. We are going to be talking about
That's right.
we'll be talking about the Koreas. And just as a really quick aside, there was this fascinating visual investigation by the New York Times on an oil tanker that had been delivering oil to North Korea. And if you haven't seen it, it's on the New York Times current website. Check out their visual investigations. Of course, we've featured that a couple of times at Journalism Under Fire, but they do extraordinary work to figure out how a Chinese ship was able to use various duplicitous means to get oil to North Korea to keep the Kim Jong-un regime moving forward. Anyway, check it out. We'll have that conversation and more a week today on North Korea, or the two Koreas. And until then, we'll see you soon. Bye-bye, everybody.